off that and just go ahead and introduce Mr. Haynes. So I'll do that. Jerry L. Haynes was raised in Carroll County. He served in the U.S. Navy from 1971 until 1975. He graduated from Virginia Tech in 1977 with a BS in civil engineering. Since 1994, he has worked as a financial planner with Virginia Retirement Specialists Incorporated. He has written 4 novels and a self-improvement program. He offers professional services as a sales training and motivational speaker. He currently lives in Pulaski with his wife, Judy. Following the presentation, Jerry will be available to answer any questions on his books, which are available for purchase. You can also find his books and other writings on his website, www.bringhopeandhappiness.com. And now, for the moment we've been waiting for, Mr. Haynes is going to do a dramatic presentation for us. I'm going to set the scene for that. The day was March 14th, 1912. The place was Hillsville, a small Appalachian mountain town in southwest Virginia. The morning was cold. The gray skies hung heavy with chilling frost. For 2 decades, the court officials and the Allen family had clashed. Floyd Allen stood before the judge, charged with a minor felony. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? 1 year in jail. The courtroom became deadly quiet. Then a gunshot broke the silence. Then a second. And third. Within 90 seconds, nearly 60 shots had been fired. 5 people would die from those shots. For the next month, until the sinking of the Titanic, every headline in the nation reported on the events of the day and its consequences. For 100 years, the county would remain divided. Listen to 2 generations of Carroll County residents, the Hayneses, as they tell you a story filled with Appalachian culture.
My name's Sanders John Jefferson Joseph Columbus Emmett Haynes. You probably think it's peculiar to have so many names, so I reckon I'll tell you. My mama, Haynes was her family name. Nobody, not even me, ever knew who my daddy was. So I think maybe she wanted to name me after my daddy, but she just didn't want anybody to be able to figure out who it was. Now, this young man here invited me to come down to talk to you about what happened up there in Carroll County 51 years ago. I reckon it'd be okay, but now, if any of you have any relatives that live back up in Carroll County, I'd just soon you not tell them that I was down here talking, because it's still a sore subject up there. Here's a paper clipping just from last August. And you can see right there it says, old timers still recall tragedy but are hesitant to discuss it, and that's the way it is. But I figure if we really wanted to talk about what happened that day back in 1912, we need to go farther back than that. We need to go back to about 1900. Now, we had this family called the Allens. They were Scot-Irish, and a lot of us right here are Scot-Irish, and those of us that are Scot-Irish, we know what it is. I mean, we came across those waters to get away from those highfalutin and mighty lords and kings, and we came to these mountains here in the Blue Ridge because we wanted to do things the way we thought we could do. But back about 1900, a strange thing happened. Now, a lot of folks, they say a watched pot never boils, but I think sometimes it's an unwatched pot that boils over. And that's what happened back up there. So, the Allens were good Scot-Irish people, and they did things their way. And they got by with it. But about 1900, a strange thing happened. The county started voting Republicans in. Republicans, Lincoln's party came in to be in office. And that just didn't go well with the Allens. They were staunch Democrats. Well, that water started heating up. All of a sudden, the Allens, they started getting charged with things. They got charged with counterfeiting and bootleg and the boot. That's what was a laugh, bootlegging. I mean, we're Scott-Irish, and anybody that's Scott-Irish knows that everybody should be able to take their corn the way they want to, and the best way is drink it out of a jar. But all of a sudden, they started getting charged for it. And then even assault and even murder. That water started boiling because the Allens wasn't used to that. And then to make it worse, once the charges was made, a lot of times the court would just throw it out. They wouldn't even hear it. But a couple times, old Floyd, he was the main part of the Allens, he would get charged and convicted, but then the governor would dismiss the charges. Now, people that don't know, they don't realize how important it was to Floyd that he not be charged with these crimes, because Floyd was big in politics. He had been elected sheriff, deputy sheriff many times, and special agent, and he'd been elected to the county commission. And if he had gone to jail, he wouldn't have been able to do any of those things. He wouldn't have even been able to vote. And voting was mighty important to him. So all of a sudden, these charges started being made. Things went on like that for about 10 years. And then it was right before Christmas. I think probably between Thanksgiving and Christmas in 1910. I was there. They had a corn shucking. Now, some of you city slickers down here, I know some of you from Snowball, and I know they don't know what goes on up in the mountains. So up in the mountains, we had what was called corn shuckings. And when you went to a corn shucking, and what it was, the farmer needed his corn shucked, so if he gave you a little bit of liquid corn and had somebody there to make music, then people would come in and shuck his corn for him. Well, there was this here tradition that if you found that red ear of corn, which was really rare, if you found that red ear of corn, you got to kiss the girl of your choice. Well, I was there, and well, you know it, Wesley Edwards, he found that red ear of corn. Now, Wesley, he had a brother, Sidney, and their mother, she was a sister to Floyd and Sidney and Garland and Victor. And their father died when they were real young, and Floyd pretty much raised those kids. He was like a papa to them. Well, old Wesley, he was a lover boy. So he found that red ear of corn, and he kissed a girl of his choice. Now, there's another tradition, and that is that you're not supposed to kiss a girl that's spoken for. The next morning, we were all in church, and it was at Pastor Allen's church. It was Sidney's and Wesley's uncle's church. And right after it started, we heard this little commotion. We looked back, and someone had come in the back door and was saying something to Wesley. So Wesley, he just kind of stood up and went outside, and we heard this little commotion going on. A few minutes later, a big commotion went on, and all of a sudden, Wesley, he jumped up, Sidney jumped up, and he went outside, and then it really got into a row then. So finally, poor old Pastor Allen, he just couldn't hold us in there any longer, and we all went running outside. And we got there pretty much in time to see Wesley and Sidney chasing 4 boys down the road, throwing rocks at them. Come find out, one of them was Willie Thomas. Willie had claimed that girl that got kissed the night before was his spoken for. And he didn't like it that she got kissed. So he had come, and apparently, though, the 4 of them just couldn't handle 2 Edwards boys. Well, we thought that was, boys being boys. So we thought that's all it was to it. Well, about 3 months later, all of a sudden, they handed down all these charges against the Edwards boys. It was about 8 different charges, everything from interfering a house of worship to interfering a house of worship while intoxicated. Now, I tell you one thing, those boys were not intoxicated because they were scared enough to their mom that they would not go to church drunk. So I know that one shouldn't stand. But the funny thing about it, there wasn't a single charge handed down against the other 4 boys. Well, I guess Mr. Floyd, he felt like maybe they better go lay low for a while. So he sent them down across Fancy Gap Mountain down into Mount Airy. About 2 months later, or about 2 weeks later, he did go in that day in order to talk to the Commonwealth Attorney, who was William Foster, and he worked it out with Mr. Foster. I think that was on a Thursday, Wednesday or a Thursday, and he promised him that he would bring those boys in himself on Monday, and he would post a bail for them, and they would take what was given to them. Well, don't know if the courts heard about it or what, but apparently somebody decided that wasn't good enough. So Sheriff Blankenship contacted Sheriff Cape Haynes. Cape Haynes was the sheriff down in Surrey County, down in Mount Airy, and he arranged for him to pick those boys up, and that he would send a deputy down and meet them at the state line. Well, Pink Samuel started down the mountain to get those boys. Along the way, he stopped at Mr. Easter. Mr. Easter owned a farm, and I hear tell that Pink only had 1 horse, and he knew the buggy wouldn't be able to come back up that mountain with only 1 horse, so he stopped to get another horse from Mr. Easter, and he deputized them to go along with them. So they went down and they got those boys and started back up. But they had 1 boy handcuffed to the back buggy and the other one tied and bound to the buggy. Well, when they started up the mountain, Mr. Easter later said he turned to Pink and he said, "Well, Pink, why are you going this way? This isn't the short way back to Hillsville. This is the long way. Besides that, you're going to go right by Floyd and Sidney Allen's place." And he said, oh, Pink just puffed up and said, "I'm a man of the law and I'll go back any damn way I want to." I'm sorry, ladies, but that's what he said. So they started back up the mountain. Sure enough, they got to the very top. And when they got to the top, Mr. Floyd was there. And they had a few words. I understand that Pink Samuel actually pulled a gun, but Floyd took the gun away and broke it over a rock, and then he hit Pink with the butt of the gun. And then I guess Mr. Easter decided he had all the deputy he wanted to have, so he took off running. And before he ran, though, he turned around and shot the tip of Floyd's finger off. So they took the boys in, or Floyd actually took the boys in on Monday. They had their trial, and they were found guilty. They were sentenced to something like, one of them got a month, and I think Wesley did get 2 months. They worked it out picking apples over on Mr. Blankenship's orchard. And everybody thought that was pretty much going to be it again. But then all of a sudden, about 3 months later, they handed down these charges against everybody, not just Floyd, but everybody that was at Sidney's store that day. They brought charges against them. Things were really getting tense now. That water was beginning to boil. So they brought Mr. Floyd in, and they decided to have a trial for him. They were to have it on March 13th. They came in that day and they had the trial, but they didn't reach the verdict. And the next day, I didn't know they hadn't reached the verdict. I had some court business, some land business I had to attend to, so I came to court that day. Now, let me show you how the court was laid out. Now, pretending I'm right here and I'm Floyd Allen. Now, right in front of me would have been the jury. And then right behind on a table behind them, now that was Judge Massey. Judge Massey. He was from right over here at Pulaski. Fine, fine man. Over here on the left against the wall, that's where Sidney Allen and Claude Swanson Allen. Now, Claude Swanson is Floyd's son, named after Governor Claude Swanson. Now, over, of course, the lawyers for Floyd's right here, and William Foster, Commonwealth Attorney, the attorneys for the state, they're right over there. And then right over here This Deck Goad. Now Deck, he was a real Republican. He was as hardcore Republican as Floyd was Democrat. A lot of people say he was the person that stirred things for the Republicans. He was the clerk of the court, and he was sitting right over here. Then you had all kinds of deputies, including Sheriff Webb. Lou Webb had just been elected and had come into office in January. So 2 months later, he was here at this courthouse. Then a bunch of deputies there. Now, I was actually sitting on a bench right back here along with some other people, and then all around the court were a lot of the other Allens and a lot of the other Edwards boys. So I was in court that day. Judge did a few things, and then there was this little tap on the door. And they went, and one of the foremen of the jury said, "We've reached a verdict." So the judge brought them in. They sat down, and the judge took the verdict, and Deck Goad began reading it. He got about halfway through, and Judge Massey said, whoa, no, it's not writ the right way. You've got to write it legal-like. So they handed it back, and William Foster, he took this book and laid it on his arm, and he kind of changed some things about it, and then he handed it to the deputy, and the deputy handed it to Lou Webb, and the Lou Webb handed it back to the foreman of the jury, and the jury signed it. Then he handed it back to Lou Webb, and then Lou Webb handed it back to Deck Goad, and Deck began reading the verdict. The verdict was guilty. Mr. Floyd was sentenced to a year in prison. Now, the lawyers for Mr. Floyd immediately said, "Your Honor, we would like to call for a retrial. We had some witnesses that couldn't make it in because of the weather." Like I say, that Judge Massey was a fair man. He said, "When do you think you could have the affidavits signed, and when do you think you could have your witnesses?" "Well, the weather's supposed to break tomorrow. We think we could have them here tomorrow." Judge said, "That's fine. We'll hear it tomorrow." Then Judge Boland. Judge Boland was one of the lawyers. He was actually a judge at one time. Judge Boland said, "Now, we assume that you also let Mr. Floyd stay out on his bail." And Judge got real quiet. He just sat there. And I thought maybe he hadn't heard what Judge Boland said. And I thought maybe Judge Boland would, repeat it so he'd hear it. And then finally Judge Massey says, no, that's not the way it's got to be. He can't be released on bail now that he's already been found guilty. If we call for a retrial tomorrow, then I'll grant bail. And then the other lawyer spoke up, and he said, "But Your Honor," said, "it's been done in this court many times before, and I know other examples in the Virginia when it's been done." Judge Massey says, no, not once he's found guilty. Boy, you could just feel that water boiling down. Floyd turned around, and he was saying some things to his lawyer. The judge had some paperwork to do, so he was filling out the paperwork. Then after a few minutes, he asked Judge Boland, "Do you have anything else?" Judge Boland said, "I guess not at this time." That's when Judge Massey turned and said, "Sheriff, take charge of your prisoner." That pot of water was about to boil over. Sheriff Webb started towards the box. When he did, I heard this sound that sounded like somebody's smacking a book on a desk. Everybody looked around, but then they figured out what it was, is that Mr. Floyd had been leaning back in his chair, and he had let the chair drop to the floor. And when he did, he stood up. Then he stood up. He started unbuttoning the sweater. And that's when I heard another sound. And I knew what that sound was. That sound was it was a gunshot. And then I heard another one. Now later in the other trials, the murder trials, Dad Code said when he saw Mr. Floyd unbuttoning that sweater, he knew he was going for a gun. Where I was sitting, I could see Mr. Floyd. I think the first gunshot was fired over to my right. By the time I looked over, and a second and a third shot had been fired, I saw Deck Goad aiming his gun, and then when I looked over, I saw Sidna and Claude Swanson, and they were aiming. Woodson Questenberry was right in front of me, and he was shooting. Mr. Floyd said all he was doing was going into his sweater pocket to remove the list of names of the witnesses he wanted to be called later. I'm not kidding. All hell broke loose in that courthouse. There were shots being fired. There were benches being turned over. There was screaming. There was people cussing. I jumped up and thought I would run out, but there was only 2 doors, and everybody was trying to make it through those 2 doors. It looked like when you got a break in the fence, and all the cows are trying to get through the one place, and I knew I would never make it out that door. I was a grown man, but I'm not ashamed to tell you, I was scared. It scared me plenty. I dropped to the floor, and I crawled underneath that bench. I would have said that the shots had lasted for 5 minutes, but people later said it was only 90 seconds. But in that 90 seconds, 60 shots had been fired. Then the shooting quit. I could barely see. There was so much smoke in the room. And I looked out, and across the way, I could see Claude Swanson and Sidna running down the side towards the door, trying to load their guns. Mr. Floyd was behind them, but he was shot so bad he was barely able to make it out the door. And then I saw Deck Goad running down on this side, loading his gun. After they got outside, there was a few more shots fired. I finally crawled out from underneath that bench. I went over to the side, and there on the floor lay Lou Webb, where he'd been standing when I first saw him. I went up, and right back here was a door into the jury room. And through that open door, I could see William Foster. And I knew he was dead too. I walked over in front of the jury. One of the jury members, I didn't know who it was at the time, but he was laying face down. It was Gus Fowler. And then I looked at the table, and down on the floor was Judge Massey trying to push himself up, blood dripping out of his coat sleeve. And I could tell he wouldn't be there long. By the next day, those 4 were dead. And a 5th person, Betty Ayers, who was my neighbor, a beautiful young girl of 18. She had been sitting 4 feet away from me on the bench that I crawled underneath. So they began having the trials. Had them over in Withville. A lot of strange things happened in those trials. People said they just weren't handled the way they were supposed to have been. Floyd and Claude Swanson was found guilty and sentenced to die in the electric chair. But the peculiar thing is, they weren't sentenced to die because they had killed somebody. They were sentenced to die because they proved that they had premeditated it. I have no doubt that some of the Allens shot and killed people that day. But I'll go to my grave saying that it was not premeditated. Horses had been tied into the stables. Sidney had deposited every bit of his money into the bank and had no cash on him. Well, after the shooting, Floyd never made it out of town. Some of the others did make it out. Sidney and Wesley Edwards, they actually made it all the way to Des Moines, Iowa before they were ever captured. And once again, that lover boy, Wesley had a girlfriend named Maud Eye Roller back in Hillsville. It wouldn't do that he not come back to see her. And he came back and he gave her $50 to come to Des Moines, Iowa to marry him. Well, Maud, she took the train and she came to Des Moines, Iowa, along with a half a dozen Baldwin Phelps detectives. So that's how they got captured. 1 year and 2 weeks after the shootout, Floyd Allen and Claude Swanson Allen was electrocuted in Richmond. The others served from 5 years to 20 years, and they were let out. Most of them moved away because they couldn't take the talk back in Carroll County. It's been 51 years, and you still don't talk about it. Maybe one day things will get better. I got myself a grandson. His name's Jerry. When he's my age, it would have been 100 years since the shootout. Maybe things will be better then. Maybe he'll even write a book about it. My name's Jerry Haynes. I grew up in Carroll County, and for years as a child I heard the story of the Carroll County tragedy. It had special meaning to us. My grandfather, his mother was the first cousin to Sidney. She had sold land to him where his house sits now on that track. Our grandmother, who married Grandpa Jeff, they lived in Fancy Gap, and they were actually kin to Judge Bowen, who was one of the lawyers for Floyd. But you didn't hear very much about it. No one wanted to talk. No one would talk for many years. The article that I have here is dated August the 12th, 1962, 50 years after it. And it states that old-timers still recall tragedy but are hesitant to discuss it. In 2010, they decided they were going to hold a 100th observance of the courthouse tragedy. The observance was to recognize the conflict, the consequences of the event. They did an excellent job of putting it together. I was happy to participate in a small measure to it, part of it being the fact that I was able to organize a memorial service for Judge Massey in the cemetery at Pulaski, and also arranged to have an open house at his home place, which very few people had ever been in. One of the impressions that will forever be etched in my mind for as long as I live was at the end of that memorial service, standing in the back, embracing each other, sharing tears, was a direct descendant of Floyd Allen and the great-granddaughter of Judge Massey. So I did do my research. I spent a year and a half researching, and I did finish my book, Mountain Justice, in time to be released for the observance. Mountain Justice is a historical fiction. It's based a lot upon facts derived from Ron Hall's The Carroll County Courthouse Tragedy. People sometimes ask me what's the difference between a nonfiction such as this and a historical fiction such as mine, and I like to describe it as a puzzle. Now, in Ron's book, he probably has 375 facts in this. So let's take a look at a 500-piece puzzle. 375 of those pieces are historical facts. Then a historical fiction takes these facts and, using a word palette, we paint in those missing pieces, using the facts that are given, but then using literary license in order to paint in, to make a story, a plot. Because nonfiction isn't a story, it's a collection of facts. And in my historical fiction, I use a fictitious character with a very original name of Jeremiah Haynes, who is a reporter for the Richmond Evening Journal. The Richmond Evening Journal was actually at the foremost in leading the campaign for the petition which had 50,000 names requesting the governor to terminate the death sentence, but it never was. And in the book, Jeremiah has become a confidant to Claude and Floyd, and Floyd gives him a slip of paper with the instructions to not read that note until the execution is over. And following the execution, Jeremiah opens up the note, and the note simply says, "Find the truth." And so he travels back to the mountains of Virginia to find the truth. But as most of us know, sometimes the truth doesn't want to be discovered. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, how common was it for people to have pistols in a courtroom like that?
If this was 15 years ago, I would have said, how many of the men in the audience today have a knife? It would have been very similar to carrying a knife. Of course, now we can't even carry the knife. But it was very, in that day, in that court, they were estimated to be probably 100 men, and there were probably at least 60 to 70 with guns. Now, probably one of the most negative things that's ever been said about Judge Massey is that they came to him, the court officials did, and asked that he collect the guns before the trial started, and he refused to do it. Now, a lot of people think, was he hard-headed? Was he foolish? I think the reason he didn't, okay, there had never been a trial in Carroll County Courthouse where the guns had been collected. If he had collected the guns